Come, Holy Spirit.
Good morning, Bellator Society. Welcome to the Livestream show. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Tracy Eddy, and Freen and I, Freen is in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm, of course, in Arizona, but we have a special guest today. Joining us also from Tennessee is Natalie Alfaro Frazier. Did I say it right?
You were so close. Oh! Alfaro Frazier.
Alfaro Frazier.
Yeah.
Y'all, I even practiced, so I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But she is joining us to talk about Catholic social teaching and Catholic social teachings and Catholic social justice. And these are topics, church teaching that are very close to her heart. And she writes about them in a blog, right? And your blog is called?
coyotesandsaints.com. And
All
then
right.
I write a lot. Most of the stuff starts on Instagram as posts that end up transferring over to Coyotes and Saints.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, welcome. It's so good to have you and get to visit with you a little bit before we went on the show. So thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Oh, I think this is going to be a very good interview, talking about social justice in this context, but also I want to throw a little promo for our podcast that's going to air on Friday, where we'll be talking about a different topic with Natalie as well. But let's jump into social justice, because I was reading our USCCB's reflections on the importance of social justice, and I'll just say what they said. They said that the need to educate all Catholics on the church's social teaching and to share the social demands of the gospel and Catholic tradition more clearly is needed, that we have this need. And then if Catholic education and formation fail to communicate our social tradition, they are not fully Catholic. Those are pretty strong words.
Mm-hmm.
Take a deep breath there.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So talk to us about your passion and how you got started in this, writing about this, and just kind of give us a little bit of maybe an intro on where you're coming from and sort of what lights your fire.
Yeah. So where I think the best place to start with it is that I, from a very young age, always had a draw to justice. And my mom is quick to tell people that one of my favorite phrases as a kid is, "It's not fair." But I would say it, to the point that my mom had to sit me down and at a young age and really explain to me that life just is not fair sometimes. And I just have all these memories of these conversations. I was lucky that I had two parents that were willing to go into those conversations with me. I remember one time sitting in the car and being like, I was probably 7 or 8. And I was just like, it would be so much easier if everyone just got the same amount of everything. And my mom was like, that is a great idea, but let's talk more about that.
Yeah.
That's
heaven.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. That's what we're striving for. Right?
Perfection. Yeah.
But humans are never going to be able to do that. Right. And I was the type of kid that I wanted to keep exploring those conversations. And I was lucky that I had two parents that were willing to go there with me. I grew up Catholic. My dad is from Nicaragua. And so that's where a lot of these conversations would bubble up, is that he came here when he was 29 as a refugee from the civil war that was happening in Nicaragua at the time. So it was the Contra and Sandinista civil war. And so I always had that narrative also in the back of our family history and why we were here. And so I think that also kind of drove this interest in social justice and social work and in activism and what that meant. So I have aunts and uncles that were very just politically active in different ways. And that's in a long, nuanced way how my parents even met in San Francisco. So it's kind of in my blood.
I was going to ask how your parents met.
Yeah. And it's a good story, but it's hard to tell without knowing people's names, because there's aunts and uncles that are now aunts and uncles because people have gotten married, but they weren't aunts.
So basically we need like graphics to be able to understand it.
Yeah.
That's going to be the next show.
Yeah. Natalie's like genealogical history. So But and then so I grew up in the Catholic Church, and as many high schoolers do, I found a youth group at a Protestant church nearby. It was a Presbyterian church, and got really plugged in there. The youth pastor that was there was also just very social justice bent, and it really helped kind of strive that forward, especially as a teenager. But I always considered myself Catholic, but wasn't going to mass. I never got confirmed. And so I ended up going to a Protestant Christian college, Seattle Pacific University. And it was actually there that I had a reversion back to the Catholic faith. And it was because of Catholic social teaching. And it was because of my interest in where is the role of the Christian when it comes to social justice. And there were so many groups out there that were doing this work, but what I was finding as I was like church hopping in Seattle was that many Protestant churches don't actually have any teachings on social justice in the way that the Catholic Church does.
Right.
And so as I was researching and trying to find like what has the role of Christians been in all of this, and kind of that same idea, Dorothy Day, who's one of my big heroes, you know, one of her big turning moments after she was Catholic, she was at a protest and she said, well, where are the Catholics? And I kind of had that same thinking, like, well, there's all this good work that's being done. Where are the Christians? And I found out that a lot of it was being done through Catholic social teaching, and a lot of it is done through religious. We see a lot of nuns and priests protesting and just being active in supporting communities in different ways. And so it was at a Protestant college that I finally had a professor who just kind of patted me on the shoulder and was like, "You're Catholic."
That's amazing.
Yeah. And was just kind of like, lean into that, Natalie, because you're driving me crazy.
We'd like for you to be their problem now.
Yeah, go home. Go. But yeah, so that's where where it really came out in this path that I'm on now, is in college, and really realizing that what I was searching for, I didn't have to come up with it on my own, because there's actually this tradition. And that's right. One of the beauties of the Catholic Church is that we have the history and the tradition and the Bible and the communion of saints. We have all of these things that are influencing and really guiding the church as we go forward. And so I especially was interested in social justice in Central America and that relationship between the United States and Central America, and just seeing where the Catholic Church played a role in that. And actually in Central America specifically, the Catholic Church played a huge role in mediation and in different capacities in the justice movements there. So another saint that is close to my heart is Saint Oscar Romero. Our oldest son, his name is Oscar after Saint Oscar Romero. But he played a huge role in my reversion back to the Catholic Church. So that's how I got
That's
started.
how you got here.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Did you guys watch the recorded discussion between Father Mike Schmitz and Father Josh Johnson recently on the current state of race relations? Okay, so Natalie's shaking her head. So there's that one part right at the beginning where they're talking about how I think it was Father Schmitz who one of his students said, you don't ever talk about racism like that. Like she gave him constructive criticism that was received well, but basically her point was, we all know that this is an objective evil, racism, and we should fight against it in the world, but we should also talk about it. And they kind of made the connection there that social justice is the same thing. Like racism isn't the only part of social justice that we really should be addressing, because we do have this beautiful, robust doctrine of social teaching in the church. I mean, we have a compendium of social doctrine of the church, just like we have a catechism. Do you have it? Perfect. So if anybody wants to know. Yeah, exactly. I mean, isn't it wonderful that we have this teaching that is so accessible and so beautifully put and compiled, but yet we don't really talk about it a lot. again, we go to a church or have been to a church where our pastor was a Franciscan, so he did a lot of talking about social justice things. But I don't think that is the experience of many Catholics. So maybe we can just like take one little baby step back and maybe just mention the 7 themes of Catholic social justice. Is that cool? Like a little catechesis here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can say them off the top of my head. Do you have them up?
I do have them written down, and they're in no
perfect.
particular order of like, hierarchy here. But if they were, maybe the first would be life and the dignity of the human person. And then we have a call to family, community, and participation. That would be another one. Rights and responsibilities. Ooh, we could spend a long time talking about that. The option for the poor and vulnerable is another. The dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, and care for God's creation. So those are the 7 main themes of Catholic social teaching. Which one of these would you say is closest to your heart? Or you can pick 2.
Yeah. Well, it's funny.
Generous.
Yeah. I think I have a hard time separating them because I think that, and especially as as the deeper that I've gotten into understanding Catholic social teaching in relationship with the work that I've done around global development. So I have a master's in public administration. And so I focused a lot on public policy and global development and community development and social change. And what does that look like? It's so interconnected. And that's what makes all of these causes and issues so complex, is because they don't function in a vacuum.
Yeah.
They, the dignity of life, there is so much connected to that in the other 6 themes that I think you're right. That is often where we need to start, because whether we're talking about anti-racism work, or we're talking about abortion, or we're talking about immigration, or we're talking about the environment, it's because it comes back to this dignity and sanctity of life and the individual, and the fact that every single person on this earth has dignity and is a child of God. And we have to remember that we don't get to choose who does and doesn't fit into that category. It's just that everyone does.
Right.
And so that's where we have to start, I think. But it can be a hard conversation to have, but it's why having those shared vocabulary is also really important when you're doing this work of just defining terms. What does this mean? And I think the term social justice often gets pegged as this like left-leaning liberal idea. But we have to recognize that we have church doctrine and things that have been approved by bishops that use the term social justice over and over and over again. And it is something that is part of our faith. We are asked to move our faith to practice, and that practice often looks like social justice.
Yes. And I would also say that social justice, just the word social, signifies, again, being made in the image of our Creator, because God, in being a unity of persons, is inherently social. Right. Like there is a unity of persons there. And by virtue of being made in the image of God, that means we are made for relationship, not just with God, but also with each other. And so that's part of just who we are on a very fundamental level. And I love how you kind of mentioned the complications that arise when we start dealing in all of the nitty gritty of social justice. But it is true. I think this is true. Maybe it's not a universal truth, and I'm happy to take it back if it's not true. But many people see environmentalism as a very kind of leftist or liberal ideology or goal. And in doing so, forget about maybe the unborn, or issues of maybe euthanasia or things like that, or even contraception, right? Like those things are for the more conservative. But there is such integration, really, when we start, again, digging a little bit deeper and seeing how caring about the environment actually does affect the right to life, does affect how people live their lives and are able to care for their children and the elderly and the sick and all of those things. And conversely, the teachings on contraception, I think this is, we teach natural family planning. And I think what sometimes I see light bulbs go off, especially kind of in the millennial generation, who are very interested in ecology and things like that. When you start talking about the ecological ramifications of hormonal contraception, I mean, bells go off because there's that integrated sense of wholeness is so important. And that's how we are going to win the world, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's funny that you brought that up because I have been surprised and almost like caught off guard how many times I've had conversations with friends who are not Catholic and are not Christian, are really like, we might have very different opinions, and they come to me talking to me and asking me about natural family planning because they want to get off birth control, because they're realizing what it's doing to their body. They're realizing what it's doing to the environment. And it's just so interesting because this goes back to the truths of the church can truly, they can live through the times. And I think that that's a great like anecdote of that, because I've had the same experience. And I think, and the piece about environment too, and this is something I feel really lucky that I got to do work in El Salvador and Nicaragua, but when people, and it goes back to the complexity of this, if we're going to be talking about the dignity of life or the dignity of workers, well, when you go and you see that there is a neighborhood next to a factory in Nicaragua, and all of the water runoff from the factory is literally causing a river down the neighborhood next door, it's really hard to separate the environmental impact of textile work and the dignity of life, because it's affecting families and generations of families. And so it's affecting them on these different levels, on health, on economic. And so that's why, like I was saying, and what you're reiterating is that it's so interconnected, and it's why it's hard to parse them out. And the U.S. Catholic bishops have it very clear, and they have a lot on there about when we're talking about pro-life, it is more than talking about abortion. The death penalty is there. Euthanasia is another topic that is there. And so we need to take that seriously as Catholics, because it is part of the teaching of the church, and we are charged with taking all of these things seriously.
We say in our family, we're pro-life from cradle to grave. And I think that is, that encompasses euthanasia, death penalty, everything. Can we back up just a little bit? You talked a little bit about your work in Nicaragua and where else?
El Salvador.
El Salvador. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did there, and just because I'm assuming maybe some of your work is it the worker or immigration policy or
That's a great question.
I want to hear. I want to hear more about that.
Yeah. So, and I mentioned my dad's from Nicaragua, so I've done various projects and trips to Nicaragua in different capacities. I, in grad school, had an opportunity to be in Nicaragua for 3 months doing a series of projects there that ended up coming back and being kind of more of a capstone culmination project. That was a museum exhibition, but that showed the relationship between the United States and Nicaragua over time. And we did that through photography and then just textiles and things that we were able to purchase and bring back. Which was fun because it was like I was able to get a rocking chair back from Nicaragua.
It's for academia.
Which was an adventure. We also somehow brought a puppy back, and that was a whole nother thing. The puppy wasn't part of the exhibition though. But yeah, so so a lot of my work in Nicaragua and El Salvador have been around community development and how U.S. policies, when it comes to immigration and trade specifically, have affected small communities in Central America.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that the United States has had intervention in Central America since before most of the countries were totally independent from Spain. So the United States has been going down there and doing different things. So a way that I like to illustrate it sometimes is that many people are surprised to learn that baseball is actually one of the most popular sports in Nicaragua. And my dad has memories of, as a kid, being taught how to play baseball by U.S. Marines.
Wow.
There's just been a U.S. presence in Central America in a lot of different ways for a long time. And it's
good or can I ask you a question? Is that good or bad? Because my kiddos are my children are adopted from Eastern Europe, and there was U.S. presence there, but it was good because they were protecting them from Russians coming over the border. So so I guess that's piqued my interest.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think
as is everything.
Yeah, it depends.
It's good and bad.
Yeah, it's good and bad. It depends on who you talk to. I think I have my opinions on it that I think that we need to recognize that the United States, and this goes into, a lot of the conversation that you're hearing right now with anti-racism overall, but the United States has often functioned on this, we are this savior that is, everything that we do is for the benefit of the world. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us buy into that. And that's not really the reality, right? Like, is that really why we're putting these policies in place? A lot of times there's a really great economic benefit for the United States. That doesn't mean that everything that's being done is awful and evil.
Right.
But there are times that what is actually really better for the other country is maybe not at the forefront of our politicians' minds or companies. And that's the other thing, is that it's not just the US government, but it's also US companies, big ag. And I focused a lot on agriculture, but textile, there's a lot of these big companies that go in, they're looking at making $1.
Right.
But that goes back to the dignity of the worker, right? And I think something that's really important, and I've been talking to a lot of Catholics about this recently, is that as Catholics that live in the United States, we still need to first be Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And Haley Stewart, who is a great blogger that I love, she blogs at Carrots for Michaelmas, recently wrote a really great post about the fact that there is an idolatry in the United States when it comes to our patriotism to the country. And we need to remember as Catholics that we are Catholics first. Mm-hmm. And there are times that political parties are not who we are answering to. It's not the country that we're answering to. We're answering to God and the church. Mm-hmm. And we need to recognize that as Catholics, we really shouldn't feel comfortable in any political camp.
True.
Yeah.
So I have my opinions. I don't about the U.S. in Central America, but I have met people that I love and adore. And actually, my father and I disagree on many of these issues because he wouldn't necessarily say that they were as negative as maybe I would. And he lived there, right? And so
to that end, I would like to tie in that Catholic perspective, because I think that the same complaints that you might be charging the United States or and not that you're charging the United States, but just that we have this sense of we're the world's savior. We're going to come in, we're going to make it better because we're Americans. Like that's what we do, right? the church, I think, also suffers with that same accusation, and that we have cut, like the church in Europe, the Franciscans came to the United States. I mean, Junipero Serra's statues are not being torn down because people think he did a really good job. And yet he is a saint of our church, right? And so we do have this complicated, we have to deal seriously with the complications of people who may indeed be trying to do the best thing, who may indeed think that, I have these principles and these policies are going to make these principles come to fruition, when in fact the opposite happens, or there are things that we can't even perceive as being detrimental in implementing the principles. And so how would you say, as Catholics, we come to terms with that? Like, as Americans, we have this American guilt, or some of us have this American guilt. We're like, mea culpa, we did it wrong. We'll withdraw now. Sorry.
Yeah.
But again, the same charges are made against the church. How do we as Catholics handle that? Or how do you as a Catholic handle that?
Yeah. It's funny that I'm from California originally. I actually am from Carmel, California. My parish growing up was Carmel Mission Basilica, where St. Junipero Serra is buried. So my my public high school are the Carmel High Padres. So this is a big topic that is not new for me, because in California, this has been an ongoing conversation for years. It's just now kind of coming to this national forefront because Junipero Serra is now a saint. And then because of this national conversation that we're having about racism and slavery and indigenous rights, which are all great conversations to have. When we're talking about St. Junipero Serra specifically in this context, I've been really honest and open. It's complicated and it is complex. And I think that one of the things as Catholics that we could do a better job at is truly listening to the ways in which people have been hurt and taking that to heart and not immediately getting defensive about it, but thinking about, wow, like I can see why that could be really frustrating or really hurtful for an indigenous group, that this mission is on their sacred land. I can see why they want to have a discussion or a dialogue about this. And specifically with St. Junipero Serra in California, what's also really hard is because the missions played such a huge role in the economy of California and the starting of California as a state, that should a saint have a statue in downtown San Francisco or in these public spaces, because many people are not saying to take them necessarily out of the churches. They're just saying, do they need to be on public land? And that's a conversation that I don't know the answer to, but I think what we're seeing is a frustration that the dialogue continues to be halted, because a lot of what's being said from the Catholic Church in California is basically like, we don't think that the statues should come down. We don't think the statues should come down, but there's not a robust conversation about why. And I was actually just talking to my mother-in-law about this, about the fact that I think we also need to have a reckoning that there's a lot of Catholics that maybe don't have a full understanding of all of the teachings of the Catholic Church. And not that we can expect everyone to be an expert in it, but what can we do as Catholics to better inform one another and also take that work on ourselves to really learn? And how that connects to this conversation about St. Junipero Serra is that I keep running into people that I'm realizing, whether they're Catholic or not, don't really understand what sainthood is.
Really? Shocking.
Yeah. And so it doesn't mean they were perfect.
Yes.
As Catholics, all we're saying is that this person is now in the communion of saints and is in heaven, and we can ask for their intercession. That doesn't mean that they were perfect. And that doesn't mean that we need to take everything from their life and say, this was totally exemplar and we need to like model everything in our life after them. But we need to wrestle with the fact that they are humans. I mean, the only humans that have been on earth that were sinless were Jesus and Mary. Everyone else, every other saint that is in heaven is going to have something in their past that is going to make someone angry.
Yeah.
The whole point is that yet they still got to heaven.
Yeah.
They still lived a life of heroic virtue. I mean, the end of their life, was virtuous. And so I think we do have to kind of just recognize that, and recognize that, like you said, maybe in 2020, how conversations would happen in 2020 are not how conversations would have happened when he walked the earth, or how dialogue and but you have to look at like all the good things that Junipero Serra did do. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But
and I think as Catholics we can venerate him, and we can acknowledge what he did for evangelization in California. And then we also have to recognize that came with some consequences that we are now having to reckon with. And I think that's what a lot of people are asking for is, so I also have a background in restorative justice. So I think my brain also goes straight to reconciliation. There needs to be some sort of dialogue that it makes it clear to those that have been hurt that we hear you and we understand, and we're taking that into consideration. And I think that's where a lot of disconnect is happening in this country right now, is that people are digging in their heels on whatever their opinion is and not really slowing down,
right,
and taking into account that people have been hurt for generations, and there's generational trauma that needs to be addressed. And we're not looking for, I'm sorry that happened, and then walking away. We're asking for true reconciliation, which for those of us that are Catholic, when you go to confession and you talk to the priest about the sins that you're bringing forward, the thinking and the understanding is that you do reparations for those sins, and then you work at not doing them again. Right. And I think it's that movement to action that has been missing, and that's what people are calling for.
What would you, in a perfect world, in your perfect world, just shy of heaven, what does that look like? Like, what do you think reparations are? Because we hear a lot about, I think we obviously have a very far way to go, but I think there are policies in place where we are trying to level the playing field, and, and maybe go back but what do reparations look like for you? What would you recommend if you were Queen President Frazier?
Yeah. I have a background in restorative justice. And I feel really passionate about that work. And the idea behind restorative justice, for those of us that might not know, is the idea is looking at conflict or disagreement in a different way. And instead of looking at it as a way that an authority is going to come in and deal with conflict to or for you, we come together and we do it with one another. And so in that light, and in my work with social change, I think the key is that it's not up. I don't know what the reparations are, because I'm a white passing Latina, right? So a lot of these things, when we're talking about race, I would be one of the people that we would consider benefiting from the system. So my role would then be to be a listener and to hear what someone who has been affected has to say about it, and really give that voice over. And so I think at the end of the day, the reparations, it needs to be a conversation that is truly listening to the victims, or those that feel as though they've been hurt by a system or a situation, and coming together and coming up with something. What we're seeing right now is those that feel that they've been affected being shut down in a lot of ways, and being told that that experience that you had didn't really happen, or you're seeing it wrong. And I think that's right there where we're failing, because just like in our marriages or in our friendships, if a friend comes to you and says, hey, like, it really hurt my feelings when you said this the other day, if your response is like, that's in your head, what's that going to do with that for that
Yeah.
friendship?
Mm-hmm.
But if you can come together and say, I'm sorry, what can I do to make it better, or at least make it as right as possible,
Mhm.
and really have a conversation about that, I think that's when we can move forward. The thing is that one policy is not going to fix it.
Right.
One
Right.
new law is not going to fix it. It needs to be an ongoing conversation of reflection and being able to talk about those things. And let's be honest, public policy doesn't necessarily have space for that.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, it maybe in a different way, just knowing that you've done some work in this area. So I assume you've worked with communities and, discussed these types of issues. Do you have any sense of maybe what like reparations for, refugees would be, or what, do you have any sort of sense of like, is it maybe a financial thing? Is it financial plus, historical monuments, or like what?
I think
Do you
it's
have
a
any
little,
sense of what it could be?
I think it's a little bit of everything that we're hearing right now. So I think whether we're talking about statues of Junipero Serra or Confederate soldiers, or we're talking about financial reparations, I think that it all needs to be taken into account. And then I would even say that this cry that we're hearing right now for defund the police is another cry for reparations. And I think what's happening is that a lot of people, and like I said earlier, are hearing things and they're being triggered, and their initial reaction is to say, no, we can't do that, without really taking into consideration what it could look like to have a conversation about what that means. Does defund the police really mean to take all the police out? For most people, it doesn't. It just means that we want to take some of the money that's going into police departments and putting them into other activities that the community could be doing that could be more beneficial at seeing some of this social change.
But man, it would be better if we said different words, if that's what we meant, because it gets really
Reform.
dicey and confusing. Yeah, reform the police. I mean, that means something different than defund the police. I do want to circle back to Catholicism really fast, though, to this idea of restorative justice in the sense of just as you acknowledged, like when we go to confession, we have penances that we do that are never enough. Like they're for us, but it's not like it restores everything to how it was. Like Jesus did that for us, right? This is the small bit that we do in faith to restore justice in the world and in our lives. But how do we know, especially in this broken and fallen world, when it's enough? Like, is it forever now? Like, is it like once we've done this thing, there's going to be another thing? Like, how do we know? It's just so difficult. Like, we know when our penance is done because I know what Father told me.
Right.
And when that's
3
done,
Hail Marys.
although I will say this, I'm going to admit this. Sometimes I do my penance twice, because sometimes, like, if it's like a couple of prayers, I'm like, oh,
that just wasn't enough.
Like, it's
I do that too.
Total scruples. I don't even think it's good, but like, is it just until we feel good about it? When does that happen?
Because we live in a fallen world, the work is not going to be done until we are in heaven. That's theologically even what's going on, right? Because we know that there's things that we can do on earth to get to heaven, but we also have a teaching of purgatory. The work doesn't just end. And that's part of being in a fallen world. And that's part of being sinful creatures. And to continue to strive for heaven is to continue to strive to be in right relationship with God and with others. And what that means is that we have to continue to have hard conversations. And in the same way that we can ask for, I think one of the reasons that I have come to really love the Communion of Saints is coming from a Latin American background, where there's so much of a focus on ancestors and the work that was done by those that came before us. And that is part of family history. And that's part of just how so many Latinos and Hispanics talk about history is that we're all connected and we come from this line, and you have pride in that lineage.
That's one of the tenets of social justice, by the way, and that call to family and community.
Yeah.
Like having that connectedness. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you have that to be connected to on earth and then also in heaven, we have the giants, or the shoulders of giants to stand on to continue this work, and it will be continual, because there are generational traumas that we are continuing to try to heal. And it's been really interesting.
And continuing to perpetuate, by the way.
Yes.
What I fix today is going to be undone tomorrow with my own sin. And so, just it's almost demoralizing when you think about it. Like, we're going to be so tired.
Yeah. And it is tiring work. And just like, and something that I wrote recently was, in the same way that we say we were Catholic, we are Catholic, we will be Catholic. I was saved, I am saved, I will be saved. I have done this work, I am doing this work, and I will continue to do this work, because it's not like you are confirmed in the Catholic Church and then your work is done. And I would say that the work for social justice is exactly the same. It's because the work of social justice, especially for Catholics, is so intertwined in our faith. It's a continual moving forward. But I think a way to look at the work of social justice is that it's looking at, if you can look at it as a parallel of when you're working on your faith life and your internal faith life, or just your family faith life, what social justice is asking is, okay, now you go and you do that outward into your community. You do that outward for society and for the world at large, because of the dignity of each individual human, no matter where they live or who they are or what they look like. Our call is that they are all children of God. And so that's just as important for them as it is for your micro family.
Yeah.
So I keep not answering that question because
it's a hard one.
Well, and because I don't think that there's really an answer. I don't think that the work is done, and I don't think that there's one thing that's going to make everything better. I think that we also have to recognize that it's internal work and external work, and that's going to look different for different people. And it's something that I've talked to a lot of other Hispanic Catholics about, and Latino Catholics about, is we find ourselves in a really interesting position right now, especially against with the conversations of anti-racism, because a lot of Hispanics, rightly so, have a lot to say about police brutality and US policy and a lot of these things that we're also hearing from the Black community. And in a lot of ways, Black folks and brown folks have been pitted against one another. And there's a lot to be said about coming together in solidarity and saying, no, this isn't right. And we collectively have experienced this. But a lot of Latinos and Hispanics, there's a lot of racism in those societies as well. And so how do we reconcile the fact that we're asking for the same rights and dignity when we're talking about immigration or the Dreamers or DACA and all of these other things that are going on that are really close to our hearts, especially as first generation from Latin America? How do we reconcile that with also then putting some of that energy into the anti-racism movement? Because again, we're all humans and all have that dignity. And so it is all connected. And so we need to show up in that solidarity with one another.
Okay, so we're coming up on time, but I have one more question, if you don't mind, before we switch gears for the podcast. I want to talk a little bit, just a teeny tiny bit, about intersectionality and, again, these the sense of connectedness and the differing issues. And I don't want to get too super political about it, but there was a bishop who I know I have great affection for and great respect for, and he is completely devoted to the social justice issues that he is devoted to, and it's very, very clear. But a couple of years ago, he announced that he was not going to attend the March for Life in his diocese because the keynote speaker, and this had been his practice, like he had always attended the March for Life. But the keynote speaker that year was a public official who was also in favor of the death penalty. And he saw that as very compromising, that he would attend this March for Life. The March for Life, yes, as Catholics, we believe in the seamless garment of the pro-life ethic. I mean, that is true. And yet, typically, the March for Life happens in January because that is the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. Typically, the March for Life is an anti-abortion demonstration, but we do understand that, just as we said before, like you can't be anti-abortion and, pro-euthanasia or pro-death penalty or all of these things. And yet we do have to come to terms with the fact that nobody's going to be 100% on the same page. Mm-hmm. So how do you, and I'm not asking you to like pass judgment on this particular bishop's stance.
Thank you.
And quite frankly, I'm not either. I'm just highlighting that this gets very complicated when there is not one politician, there is not one party, there is not one platform that's going to be 100% something I agree with, but I still have to stand for those things that matter to me, even if it means I'm standing beside someone that I don't agree with. And you mentioned Dorothy Day. I think she was a great example of this, but how do you as a Catholic navigate that in terms of building solidarity and that intersectionality?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, and people like Dorothy, this is why the Communion of Saints, and even though she's not a saint yet, but why it's so important to have these people in our lives that we can like look towards, because she's been such a great role model in this. But I think at the end of the day, it's really taking into account almost an examine of conscience, of really thinking about how does this all work together? And whether it's about the voting booth or supporting a particular movement or platform or whatever it is, I think it needs to come down to, does this put the church and the church's teaching in scandal in any way? And does that put me in scandal? And I think that's been something that I often come back to. And Dorothy Day is famous for never having voted, even though she was really instrumental in the suffrage movement.
Which we don't necessarily recommend.
Yeah, I don't.
Dorothy.
I know. And I don't know if that's totally true, but it's like a known rumor about her that she never voted. Yeah.
Fits the narrative.
It fits the narrative, yeah. But yeah, so I think that each person individually needs to decide how to move forward with that. And I think that the more that we can find solidarity with each other and realize that none of us are going to get it totally right, but we need to stop judging people for making a decision that's different than ours, because what it comes down to, and I'll be really honest and open about my own personal experience, it's really hard for me to take abortion into account and immigration, because immigration is something, and those policies is something that directly affects my family. And so how do I reconcile that when I basically have a two-party system and neither of which are really helping me out? And so there's third party. I know that Haley Stewart, who I mentioned earlier, kind of opened my eyes to like, there are third party candidates, and as voters, we have different ways that we can show our participation in that process. And I think as much as I think voting is really important, and I will like drag people to register to vote because I think it's so important. I also think that people really underestimate the amount of work that can be done on a local level.
Yes.
And in my background in community development, it has just furthered my thinking and just like my conviction that true change starts in your local community. And that means local elections too, but that also means getting your hands dirty and getting out there and figuring out what's going on in your community and what are tangible things that you can do. And then you start to see how it builds.
It also means that peace starts in our home, and any change you want to see out there begins around your dinner table.
Yeah. And I have heard a lot of people too talk about like, well, when should you start talking to your kids about this thing? And I'm going to go ahead and again, pat my parents on the back. When they are listening to you, go ahead and start talking about it. We talk to my son who's 4.5 all the time about things that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to give them all of the details, but there's really simple ways to talk about it that their brain starts thinking about it. And why we tithe, why we volunteer, and all of those things are good, but then what can you do to take that a step further? And it goes into, you need to have, as Catholics, we're called to have right belief and right practice. And part of that right practice is actually going out and having your faith move you forward in your community. And that's one of the beauties of the neighborhood parish. And again, we're lucky here at St. Philip. There's we're both connected, where there are so many ministries, but a lot of the work is really, really grounded in local work. And that doesn't have to just be through your parish. That can also be, if you want to get involved in anti-racism work, go and find, there's been prayer vigils. There have been so many different activities that you can find out about these groups that have been already doing this work and figure out how you can get connected. And sometimes that's monetarily, and sometimes that is just bodies showing up and doing some of the work. So I would say that it's often overwhelming to think about it from like a national standpoint. And there's some of us that have spent way too much money on getting degrees to be able to be experts in that. And that's the good work that we've committed our life to. But then as individual people, just get your hands dirty in your community. And that means your neighborhood, your neighborhood, your parish community, your diocese community, and start to think on that level. And then you can start to see how, these policies, if we change it at the local level, it really does ripple out. So as much as it comes down, it also goes up. So
amen. Okay. One last question to wrap this up. Other than the compendium of the church's teaching on social doctrine, are there any encyclicals that you would say, when this live stream is over, people go read this thing?
Yes. Yeah, I wrote some down.
We did not plan that, by the way.
So first I'll say some documents to look at. You hear about Humanae Vitae a lot. Pope Francis's encyclical about the environment is a great one.
Yes.
Yeah, that one's a great one. Let's see if I can find my notes where I wrote them down. And then while I'm looking for that, some saints to look up and look at their life. Saint Oscar Romero, Dorothy Day. A lot of people don't realize that Dorothy Day was actually kind of forced into the role that she had by a man named Peter Morin, who was actually the mastermind behind a lot of the work. And he's fascinating to learn about. He grew up like one of 22 kids on a French farm. Yeah. So fascinating. Saint Martin de Porres is a great saint to look at as well. He was my confirmation saint. And so those are some of the saints to look at. And then Saint Pope John Paul II is another great, his encyclicals. He has encyclicals about solidarity and the dignity of the worker. And I would also really suggest to go to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, to their website. There is so much information on there when it comes to solidarity, to social justice, to pro-life, and really what it means as Catholics and what the church teaching calls us to do and to believe and to think about, and in the context of the United States. But there's also information on there, and it's part of the Catholic social teaching on international policy and how, as Catholics, how we should look at that. and take that into consideration. So those are some things to keep you busy.
Love it. That's exactly what we wanted.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Natalie.
Yeah, thank you.
All right,
Thank
we're
you
gonna
so
we're gonna
much.
hop off this live stream and move to the podcast. And Natalie has been
Yes.
so gracious; she's gonna stay with us. But we're gonna change topics. So if you watch the podcast, if you've watched this live stream, don't worry, we've got more stuff to talk about. If you can imagine that. So join us on Friday for the podcast. And again, thanks for joining us. If you would like to comment and give us any feedback, we'd love that. And also, if you want to go to our YouTube channel, that's where you can find this recording also. So thank y'all, and we will talk on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you guys.